This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Ah, Smart Water. Pure, crisp taste.
That's really good water.
It's the kind of water that says, I have my life together.
I do feel more sophisticated.
Smart Water. For those with a taste for taste. Grab yours today.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Tim Murphy, a national correspondent at Mother Jones. Tim's written a number of pieces on Zohran Mamdani, the New York City mayoral race, and what it means not just for America's largest city, but for American politics more generally, all of which we will be discussing today. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I thought that before we dove into the mayoral race, we could talk about Donald Trump, because there are definitely some connections here. Specifically, I know you thought a lot about how he performed in the city in 2024 compared to his past presidential races and what's going on here. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people looked at the presidential election results last November, you immediately look at the swing states. Donald Trump went 7 for 7 in those states, and obviously billions of dollars were spent to try and move voters. The reality is that the swing states were kind of a bit of an aberration. All of those campaign ads from Kamala Harris, they didn't fully work, but they kind of worked. She actually overperformed in those states relative to the rest of the country. The big story, other than the winner and loser, of what happened was what was happening in blue states and in blue cities. The absolute nadir for Democratic performance in 2024 was in New York City, followed closely by places like Chicago, Los Angeles. What happened in New York was a kind of a political earthquake. Trump had improved his showing between 2016 and 2020, and then the Republicans had done pretty well in New York State and New York City in 2022. In 2024, the three biggest swings in the country at the congressional level were all in New York City, in the Bronx or Queens, or both in the case of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's district. All three of these districts that I'm talking about shifted 22 points in their margin toward Donald Trump. Compared to 2020. This was titanic shifts within the city. Trump picked up about Trump picked up about 100,000 votes in the city overall compared to 2020. Kamala Harris lost about 500,000 compared to Joe Biden. So there was an uptick in support for Trump and a collapse in support for Democrats, which was concentrated most particularly in non-white, first, second generation immigrant neighborhoods in the city. This isn't like your white working class Trump voter we're talking about, Latinos, Chinese Americans, Bangladeshis, kind of across the board. There was these huge shifts. So New York City embodied something that was happening across the country last year.
And so I guess the even more important question is, well, what did you take away from that? And more important than that, what did, Mamdani and Cuomo, the sort of the top two folks in the New York City mayoral primary, what do you think they took away from that as they campaigned for the mayor's slot?
Yeah, there's sort of a series of takeaways, some of which are very broadly applicable and some of which feel a little bit more New York focused. In general, what you saw in New York City did play out across the country where, first naturalized citizens shifted 20 points toward Trump over the last election. So if you weren't born in the U.S., but you were able to vote, you were moving hugely, as you would say, toward Trump. And obviously New York City has a huge number of naturalized citizens voting. across the board, Black men, Asian men, Hispanic men and women, all shifted substantially toward Trump in the election. And of course, these populations are very well represented in New York City. And so, in fact, that was kind of exacerbated in New York City. But you also have, you have a unique media ecosystem that's able to kind of drive a bit of negativity toward how things are going in the city, especially with the New York Post. And you have a kind of atrophied and dysfunctional local Democratic Party that has struggled to engage and mobilize people for Democratic candidates or causes. And so that's all kind of feeding into this. Now, what happened immediately after the election, like 1 week after the election, Zohran Mamdani, an assembly member from a very kind of liberal corner of Queens, just went out on the street corners in the Bronx and in a different part of Queens in precincts that had swung very dramatically toward Trump. And these were not, this wasn't Archie Bunker. This was, Bangladeshi neighborhoods. These were Latinos. This was the pastiche of New York's kind of, Rainbow Coalition. And he just asked people, like, did you vote? And people would say, well, a lot of people would say no, or they would say they voted for Trump, and you would ask them why. And what he got was this kind of drumbeat of answers about affordability and how expensive things were getting and how nothing was changing for the good. And also a sense that Democrats just were not with them on that, not listening to them, and also woefully out of step on things like Gaza. And so he took that feedback, and maybe to some degree that was kind of self-serving. He's only showing the responses maybe that dovetail with his message a little bit, but he took that, he put out this video, it got millions of views. And it was kind of mile marker 1 in this intra-democratic debate over kind of what happened and where to go. Andrew Cuomo took a much different direction. Of course, he was kind of in hibernation to some extent after resigning the governorship. He took a kind of a much more conventional takeaway that kind of aligns with like what you've heard a lot more kind of on cable news and media, maybe, among kind of the donor class a bit more, which is, as he put it, we lost because we went too far left. He blames discussions about, transgender teens in high school sports, for instance, as derailing the message. He took aim at the slogan defund the police as, the 3 dumbest words in politics. So he took a kind of standard discourse that we've been hearing after the election, and he championed that. Mamdani went much more aggressively and literally out into the streets with a different takeaway.
And, in one of the articles, in preparing for this, I read a bunch of your articles for Mother Jones. And one of them, you wrote about the problems of disillusionment and disengagement, which you sort of alluded to. I mean, in New York City, you were focusing on, but also you mentioned in many other large cities, which are almost generally speaking controlled by Democrats. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you understand these problems, this disillusionment, disengagement, and why do you think they're just so very significant at this point, at least for Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, this is not just a New York City problem. It's a problem in a lot of kind of non-competitive, heavily Democratic cities, particularly in states that aren't competitive at the top of the level. So on one hand, you just simply don't have the level of investment every 2 or 4 years coming in to try and, mobilize people. And those muscles just don't really work. And there's not a lot of weightlifting going on. But you have in kind of these one party cities, and particularly in New York, a lot of the political energy is Democrats attacking Democrats. Andrew Cuomo is a great example. I mean, he, as governor, is kind of consistently trying to kind of malign his progressive opponents and make, allyship with Republicans instead. So that you have a kind of a situation where Republicans are running against Democrats, of course, but Democrats are also usually running against Democrats. And that's not in the long term good for the brand of the Democratic Party. You also, you have this kind of these archaic machines, in Brooklyn and Queens, where nominally these are huge local Democratic parties. The Brooklyn Democratic Party purports to be the largest local party organization in America, but the reality is that they're not actually kind of investing in any kind of get at the vote machinery. They're largely just kind of competing for judicial races and like kind of monopolizing that. And so they have the kind of negative effects of a machine without the positive, electoral effects of a machine. And so you just don't have a very healthy civic culture. These elections are in off years, in a way that just kind of benefits incumbency. And so the reality is that they're plagued by terrible turnout. So in 1953, 93% of voters participated in the mayoral election in New York City.
Wow.
4 years ago, when Eric Adams won, 23% turnout. People just aren't showing up. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez beat Joe Crowley in this, huge upset, Joe Crowley didn't even get 13,000 votes, and he was the head of the Queens Democratic Party, which is this local machine. So that kind of irrelevance of local Democratic Party operations and elected officials has allowed not just kind of support for Trump to creep in and support for the other guy, but it's also allowed the far left of the party, progressives and democratic socialists to exploit that and get organized and develop a power base of their own.
You mentioned Democratic Socialists, and of course that would have to come up in our conversation because Mamdani is famously or infamously, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, a Democratic Socialist. And I think a lot of folks don't really understand what that means. I mean, it's not a political party. It's sort of an activist organization, if you will. And I took a look at the Constitution of the Democratic Socialists this week. But part of it, they say they reject an economic order based on private profit and share a vision of a social order based on popular control of resources and production, as well as equitable distribution. Now, I think to a lot of Americans, well, many of pretty much anyone who's not a Democratic Socialist or to the left of that, that's going to sound pretty radical. And I'm wondering is if you think that's what Mamdani believes in, kind of core beliefs.
I think there's a kind of interesting, and it comes up in different ways with all sorts of politicians, the kind of divide between values and actual kind of policy. I think like his values are certainly Democratic Socialist. And, he said they've been kind of videos have come up where he talks about his opposition to private property, from, around 2020 or when he's been asked recently about what he thinks about capitalism and he doesn't really like it. So he's not, I don't think he's hiding the ball on that. And it's fair to say that he's certainly aligned, with the Democratic Socialists, but he's also kind of within the DSA and particularly within the DSA in New York City, as it's established itself as a local power base. There's a kind of a more pragmatic wing of the DSA. And I know that sounds kind of like a bit of a joke, but in all seriousness, I mean, that have really committed themselves to organizing and participating within Democratic Party politics, and cultivated more of a big tent. And so when you look at Mamdani, the DSA bona fides are real in a way that really helped him because no one on the left was questioning whether he was really with them. But it also meant he didn't have to keep explaining himself to them and could focus more on just communicating to regular people in a non kind of democratic socialist way. So he had, because he had this credibility with DSA, he didn't have to run as overtly of a kind of a leftist campaign, I think.
I think Donald Trump has proven that you don't have to be of the people to connect with the people. And it occurs to me when you mentioned that, Mamdani has said he's not crazy about capitalism. I could hear some pushback from people saying, oh, sure, look, you're kind of a Nepo baby sort of guy. And you got, these wealthy parents. And so it's easy for you to say this sort of thing. But is there any kind of a pushback or a sense from some folks trying to paint him as sort of a lightweight opposer, that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of, he did grow up, relatively privileged, by by a lot of standards, although by standards of maybe upper Manhattan, maybe a little bit, less dramatic.
Yeah.
After all, his opponent did grow up in the governor's mansion. And I think, he's been able to wear that in part because he hasn't run from that. I think like it's kind of understood that he is this kind of, he does have this privileged background. He does have roots in not just, filmmaking and but also, Colombia, and that's helped him along the way. The idea of like champagne socialist is a very old one that goes back, to the 1910s in New York City, with kind of affluent leftists funding all manner of, socialist publications, in Greenwich Village or wherever. So it's not a concept that I think people in like DSA have necessarily like trip over to kind of understand. And I would definitely say his status as, somebody who's grown up in these kind of environments of mass media and academia has kind of helped shape him into the politician he is, which is just incredibly, he's just incredibly quick with it, like with whatever he wants to say. He's incredibly, camera ready and telegenic and able to kind of, really catch on in a media environment that other Democrats have struggled to.
Yeah, I think before Mamdani, the most well-known Democratic socialists in the U.S., at least, have been Bernie and AOC. But of course, both of them are in legislative positions. And as far as I can tell, I tried to do some research on this, and I can't find an instance of any Democratic socialist in a major executive position. I mean, like a big city mayor or governorship, that sort of thing. And it occurs to me that Democratic socialism is sort of might be difficult to sell to the general public, even for somebody with a lot of experience. But then you have Mamdani come in with an ideology that might at least be a little alien, more than a little alienating for plenty of folks. And then he's kind of being thrust into, because he's almost certainly going to win, thrust into a major executive position. I would imagine that's quite a challenge.
Yeah, it will be a kind of a steep climb for him. I will say it's almost kind of a bit of trivia, really. I don't think most people know this. David Dinkins was the penultimate Democratic mayor of New York City. He was the mayor elected in 1980 who lost to Rudy Giuliani. He was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. So he technically does check that box. Now, the organization's a lot different now than it was then. Now we're talking about, as you said, this kind of organization within, the kind of party system where it's really kind of established itself as a beachhead along the East River in neighborhoods of like North Brooklyn and Northwest Queens. They've got about half a dozen state assembly members, state senators, and city council members. So like the kind of modern DSA in New York City really dates back to kind of the post 2016 election when it's
makes sense.
Really thrown itself into these organizations. But beyond, this trivia about David Dinkins, you're right. It hasn't. It's not something people are used to voting for their major executives outside of Burlington, Vermont. And I think again, when we talk about Mamdani and how he was able to succeed in the campaign, it does go beyond the Democratic socialism and into his ability to cast himself as a Big Tent candidate. One of the biggest things that he did in this race was his alliance with Brad Lander, the progressive city comptroller who represents, who formerly represented a part of North Brooklyn in the city council. And Lander, I think Lander like kind of helped to give him credibility to a part of the electorate that might have been more skeptical of Mamdani on, his kind of political ideology or his, opposition to, Israeli policies. Lander, as this progressive, Jewish citywide elected official, kind of symbolized not just the kind of larger tent that Mamdani was a part of, but also gave a hint as to how he might govern in terms of bringing in people who aren't just doctrinaire socialists, but people who are kind of your standard issue progressives, people who are kind of more technocratic and definitely bring a wealth of governing experience. So where I think some people have failed by staying inside their ideological box, Mamdani was able to widen that, and in part with his kind of natural collegial ability to kind of build relationships with people.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Get lost in the acoustic brilliance of 3D audio that surrounds you. Feel the embrace of the massage seats that adapt to your every move. Experience the warmth of a vehicle that welcomes you as you approach. We could tell you what makes a Lincoln SUV so extraordinary, but don't take our word for it. Take it on a test drive at the Lincoln Summer Invitation with exclusive offers on now, only at your local Lincoln retailer.
You obviously know way more about New York politics than I do, but when I looked at this race, I thought, well, I had a hard time getting a sense of whether it was more about Mamdani's message really resonating or the fact that Andrew Cuomo, talk about damaged goods, in a weird way, right? I guess to me, because clearly he's this sort of creepy sex predator kind of guy. Okay, right away I have a problem with that. But then there's the fact that he's also really powerful. And so I wonder if there was a dynamic where Cuomo decided he was going to be the sort of establishment guy. Everyone was too afraid of him to challenge him, but everyone knew that he was a really awful candidate. And so is this more like a Mamdani is great sort of thing, or Cuomo, my God, why did this guy run? What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, there's that old question, would you rather be loved or feared? I think Cuomo kind of answered that here.
Yeah.
People feared Andrew Cuomo, but ultimately that was not conducive to building a larger coalition. And I kind of he had this drumbeat of endorsements from people who had previously denounced him and called for him to resign. But I think that normally an endorsement kind of builds hype, for a candidacy, but these endorsements rolling out for Cuomo from people who had said such, rough things about Cuomo kind of underscored that kind of intimidating, power hungry, fearful atmosphere that he's cultivated in a kind of counterproductive way. It's hard to see how this race plays out without Cuomo. His unpopularity is such a huge factor in this. Somebody just crunched the numbers the other day with the New York City Board of Election results, and they found that, because it's a ranked choice system, so you get to pick five people. So most ballots are not just Mamdani or Cuomo; they're filled with a number of candidates, or 11 people on the Democratic ballot. And they found, based on the numbers and who people had included on their ballot, of course Mamdani won. But in a head-to-head, Lander also received more votes than Cuomo if you just looked at ballots with Lander on them. Adrian Adams, the city council speaker, who only got 4% of the vote in the first round, also would have beat Cuomo, according to these ranked choice calculations. So he was really, in the eyes of the electorate, really kind of like the fourth favorite, in terms of broad appeal. I mean, he was just really, really, really disliked. And the slogan that caught on, that was well organized from last fall was "Dream," and it was originally "Don't rank Eric or Andrew for mayor." Eric being the current mayor, Eric Adams. Once he dropped out of the Democratic primary to run as an independent, it just became "Don't rank evil Andrew for mayor." And you would see stickers, on lampposts that just said, "Don't rank evil Andrew for mayor." You would see people with hats and T-shirts. It was not putting their best foot forward when it came to finding an anti-Mamdani candidate. And I think, in some sense, the kind of non-Mamdani faction of New York politics, of New York City politics, which is, not necessarily represented by this kind of carpetbagger from Westchester County, Andrew Cuomo, suffered from the kind of collective action problem that Democrats have suffered from in the past, particularly in the 2024 lack of a Democratic primary for president. where they kind of all recognize that this wasn't really the best vessel to advance their cause forward. If you're like a big business leader or something in the city, but nobody could kind of coalesce around some other alternative to the kind of former governor or the rising Democratic Socialist. And they still haven't.
Yeah. I guess it's too bad that Mike Bloomberg already had the job. I don't know, but yeah, because he supported Cuomo in the primary, and I wasn't really surprised by that. But some of Cuomo's support is sort of weird, like Bill Ackman, the billionaire hedge fund guy who's a huge Trump and huge anti-Harvard guy. He was I believe, one of the largest supporters of Cuomo. So was this just sort of like oh my God, we need to stop this Democratic Socialist maniac from getting anywhere near the office?
That's part of it. I think the donor class in the Democratic and Republican parties have both kind of whipped themselves into a frenzy about Mamdani and have kind of come to think of him as a kind of a great threat to their way of doing business, in part because he's pledged to raise taxes on billionaires, basically, in New York City to pay for his policy programs. And of course, that's not really up to him. He'd need to get buy-in from Governor Kathy Hochul, who has promised to be a bulwark against that, basically. Now, one of the things that's, interesting about this blue city, blue state dynamic is the way it kind of collapses a lot of these traditional partisan silos. So now Ackman is a recent convert to the MAGA cause, and has been a Democrat in the past. But you also see donors like Ken Langone, I think the Home Depot co-founder, big Republican donor, but he also supports, he's also supported, the Cuomo super PAC. You've got plenty of kind of Republican donors who are kind of supporting the centrist Democrat for the purposes of New York City mayoral politics, in part just because it is a one party city. But Mamdani, I will say, and again, is this kind of pragmatic streak that I think his opponents underappreciated. He was cultivating, if not the full on support of the New York City business community, which he's not going to get, at least this kind of like, I'm not like the great Satan, like he was meeting with the head of the Partnership for New York, which is this kind of almost like shadow government of, the kind of greatest, power in the city that you don't really know of these business leaders who, wield a lot of kind of power. He was meeting with the head of that in September, even before he formally launched his campaign, just to kind of be like, here's who I am. I'm running. I want to have a conversation. So he has certainly not neutralized, the threat of kind of big money coming in against him. But I think, they've found that he's also not, he's not quite Bernie Sanders either in that regard.
Well, let's talk about his campaign message. And as I understand it, it basically revolves kind of big picture on making the city more affordable, but in particular, freezing rents and rent-stabilized apartments, fast and free city bus service, free childcare for every New Yorker up to, I think it's 5 years old, and then this a network of city-owned, not-for-profit grocery stores seem to be kind of the main points I pulled out. And I'm curious, of those things, you mentioned this kind of before about needing support for some stuff. Which of these things could he do more or less on his own, and what's going to require approval from the state or other bodies to work with other people?
Yeah, it's kind of a mix, and again, the fact that you kind of rattle that off in about 15 seconds is kind of the point. This is a really concise kind of politics that doesn't need a translation. Approve or disapprove of whatever the recommendations are, and he can basically just freeze the rent. And so I would expect him to do that. In terms of making buses fast, well, there's a lot of agency to do that within the city and the Department of Transportation in terms of setting aside, designated bus lanes, bus lane enforcement, things like that. That's doable. Making them free, that requires a lot of money from the MTA, which is a state agency controlled by Kathy Hochul. So that would require a bit of finesse. Childcare, universal childcare, which is basically expanding something that was Bill de Blasio's major accomplishment as mayor, which was pre-K for 4-year-olds, universal and free. Well, that's going to require a lot of money. and like a tax hike to pay for that. So that'll require some finesse in Albany. That Governor Hochul has already said that she's going to kind of put her foot down on. And then the city-owned grocery stores is kind of, it's on its face. It's the thing that sounds like the most socialistic. And in practice is one of the things that sounds kind of the most technocratic. It's basically it's basically a trial city-owned grocery store in each of the boroughs in food deserts. So it's not an enormous. It's not like he's trying to start Walmart. But that will also, of course, take funds. Now, I guess once it's a business, maybe the cash flow would take care of itself to some degree. But that would also take some money. Now, historically, the mayor goes up to Albany for what they call Tin Cup Day, where they shake their tin cup and kind of, sing for their supper. And they usually kind of get one thing from a new mayor gets like one thing from the governor. This is just kind of how the transactional politics works in New York. And I'm not quite sure what Mamdani would get if he won. But there's these cross currents where Hochul is also up for re-election next year. So you have kind of 2025 running up against 2026, and she's not going to want to raise taxes. She's also not going to want to alienate New York City. So something will have to kind of give for both of them, I think.
Yeah, and so he's not going to get all of this. And if he did, it would be awfully expensive. But in terms of paying for whatever he does end up getting, I know one of the proposals is to raise the corporate tax rate from, I believe, 8.85 to 11.5%, and then add a flat 2% tax for New Yorkers who make more than $1 million a year. And I can hear a lot of folks on the right say, well, that is a great way to get businesses to either leave the city or to not have new businesses come and say, well, we'll just go to Austin or maybe somewhere in New Jersey or somewhere like that, or wealthier individuals just to say this is just enough, and kind of followed Donald Trump's lead and said, I'm going to Florida or whatever. How much of a concern is that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some degree of real concern. I think like the way that he's addressed this and would talk about it on the campaign is, okay, look, I'm going to make this like basically the same rate as New Jersey. And so what are you going to do? Move to New Jersey? And clearly like New Jersey is a thriving place. And in part, it's a thriving place because it's next to New York City. And the other aspect, of course, is that, Kathy Hochul already raised taxes, and we heard these complaints like during the pandemic. And the reality is that this hasn't really happened. So that's kind of what he's got going for him. And when he's met with business leaders from, for instance, the Partnership for New York, that's basically what he said, that I think you're bluffing. I don't think you're going to move. When you get to people at this level, I mean, Bill Ackman has, got big places in the Hamptons. Like all these people are kind of shuttling between New York City or Palm Beach. Some of the biggest donors against Mamdani don't live in New York City at all to begin with. The Waltons were chipping in. You have Palm Beach billionaires. It doesn't take too many more days of like extra residency in Florida to make that your primary residence versus New York City. So it's also not asking a lot of these kind of big money guys to make that switch. It's not like me packing up and moving to Florida. A lot of these guys are already spending a lot of time there. So I think that is a real thing he'll have to deal with. And if you look back at the last progressive mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, one of the defining features of his tenure was this inability to make alliances, get along with the city's kind of big money crowd. Obviously, Mike Bloomberg thrived in that environment. All of his strengths as a mayor kind of emanated from that. De Blasio just did not want to go to the parties. He didn't want to shake hands. They just didn't trust him, and he didn't trust them. And that, I wouldn't say spoiled his entire tenure, but it did kind of define it to some degree. Mamdani has certainly been trying to kind of, I think, steer clear of that to some degree, but by trying to kind of like have these meetings and talk to people. He certainly has, this kind of, film studio social graces about him. But these clashes over how much money we're going to try to take from the 1% are going to be a really big deal for how the mayoralty goes.
Now, I want to talk about a couple of controversies. I understand that there's a member of Congress who actually petitioned to have Mamdani's citizenship revoked. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, this was a Congressman, Andy Ogles from Tennessee. He is a mess. He's like the George Santos of Middle Tennessee. His entire biography is dubious at best. He's sort of made all sorts of claims about, being in law enforcement or having these kind of degrees, and they don't really check out. He's been investigated, and has sort of made himself into this kind of cartoon character on behalf of Donald Trump as a way maybe of kind of insulating himself from any kind of repercussions and keeping his job. And so you can kind of count on him to be first out of the gate with this kind of stuff. And yeah, he's called for Mamdani, who was born in Uganda and naturalized, and is now a naturalized citizen, to have his citizenship stripped and to be deported from the country. And as I guess his citation for that is, Mamdani, prior to getting into politics, had a rap career. It was Mr. Cardamom or Young Cardamom. It's actually wasn't even that bad. I don't think he wasn't going to go pro in it, however. And I think he had a lyric in there that Ogles decided constituted material support for terrorism, which meant that Mamdani would have allegedly been misleading in his citizenship application, because I'm sure you have to check a box saying that you're not a terrorist. And therefore it was all null and void, and that he should be kicked out of the country. And I don't think that not all the response to Mamdani's victory has fallen along those lines. That is kind of the maximalist version of it. But it does kind of speak to sort of the hysteria in some circles that the mayoral election has produced.
And what about the whole kerfuffle over globalized intifada?
Yeah, so this is a phrase that Mamdani himself has not used. It's gained, I wouldn't say it's gained traction. It's a phrase that's been used by pro-Palestine or anti-Israel protesters that I guess can simply mean, it can simply mean, like rise up, basically, and as kind of a protest rallying cry. But you can also obviously see how it could feel threatening, to a lot of people. And of course, there has been anti-Semitic and anti-Israel violence in the United States. And there's been kind of rising anti-Semitism in New York City. And so this is so Mamdani was asked, because he is, a very prominent politician who comes out of the kind of pro-Palestine movement, who's been very outspoken in his criticism of Israel. He was asked on the Bulwark podcast to, basically what he thinks about globalized intifada, and he wouldn't condemn it. He said he doesn't use it. It's not how he speaks, but he's not there to condemn the use of the term. And that's really become something that people have latched onto. Like, will you condemn this? Will you condemn this? His argument, I guess, on top of not simply saying he doesn't speak like that, is that kind of we're in this moment of like kind of government suppression of political speech, in particular, political kind of targeting of pro-Palestine protesters, such as, the former Columbia student Mahmoud Khalil, or the student at Tufts University, both of whom are now kind of back free from government detention, at least for now. You don't want to add to that by just trying to kind of censor pro-Palestine speech. As this is kind of dragged on and he just keeps getting asked about it, I think he told the business leaders at the partnership in New York who were pressing him on that, that he would discourage the use of the term. So he's kind of moved a little bit on that, but doesn't want to be moved to kind of full out condemning that kind of rhetoric in this particular moment.
Does that present a particular problem for him? Because, I mean, in New York City, I think around, I want to say 11, 12% Jewish population, the biggest, I believe the biggest Jewish population center outside of Israel in the world. And I'm wondering how much of a problem that caused these stances have caused him or could cause him, or is it just that, well, it's such a one-party city, it really doesn't even matter that much?
It's caused a lot of friction, in particular kind of like among, I think it's helped shape how people like Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries have approached his candidacy, because they don't really want to be seen, particularly at the national level, as being kind of that kind of critical, that anti-Israel, that pro-Palestine, and they don't really want to be associated with that kind of rhetoric, even though, again, it's not Mamdani's chosen rhetoric. So I think it definitely is a factor. And I think, in the primary, you had this big divide in the Jewish electorate in New York City, which is about a million Jewish residents of New York City. Cuomo secured kind of near unanimous support in places like Borough Park or South Williamsburg with really large Orthodox Jewish populations. But Mamdani did really, really well among more liberal Jewish voters. And so there was kind of a breakdown among Jewish voters more broadly, just as there is among Jewish voters on Israel and in Palestine. So it hasn't been, it's not just this kind of either or thing. And I will say, Mamdani, well, he's been kind of, I think his support is constrained to some degree in terms of, stances he's taken on Israel. It's also, it's a city with 1 million Muslim voters, for instance, who, many of whom felt like they weren't really being spoken to or even seen by a lot of political candidates, and certainly kind of not seen in the way that a lot of political candidates have been talking about Israel. Like, it was kind of seen as taken for granted that the next mayor is going to make a trip to Israel. They had a big scene at the debate where everybody was asked, where are you going to go on your first trip as mayor? Cuomo said he would go to Israel. Whitney Tilson, another candidate, said he would go to Israel. When it got to Mamdani, he said he was going to stay in New York City. He wasn't going to go anywhere, and ended up kind of getting a number of follow-up questions on why he wouldn't go to Israel. So I think, well, there's kind of, I think, a reputational hit that he will take for people who fear that they just don't trust him when it comes to, anti-Semitism or things like that. He has managed to appeal to a very large number of people who felt like Democrats weren't speaking to them.
When Mamdani won the primary, there were some folks on the right who were practically gleeful at the prospect. When you see his background, you kind of understand why you'd be like this perfect straw man to put up. This is what Democrats want, right? But I wonder the extent to which you think that Republicans will be successful in what seem to be their efforts to paint him as the face of the future of the Democratic Party. Because already, pretty clearly, it seems to me that the Democratic leadership in D.C., they don't really want anything to do with them because they just feel like that might work in New York City, but we're not really sure about the rest of the country. And so I don't really get the sense that ever a mayor has sort of been the face of a party, but clearly I understand why Republicans want to do that. Do you think that given the visibility of Mamdani and if Trump and Republicans really work on this, do you think they'll be able to sort of make him the face of the now pretty much leaderless Democratic Party in this country?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ironic because, 4 years ago, Eric Adams had just won the Democratic nomination for mayor of New York City. He's no longer even a Democrat, but he was like immediately kind of feted by the Democratic Party. He was invited to speak to the DCCC about like how to win campaigns, although he had only just beaten other Democrats. He was taken to the White House. People were saying that this guy should run for president. And so there's kind of a funny reversal where now, Mamdani is, I guess, kind of being shepherded around the hill by AOC and meeting with a lot of, reluctant people, and prominent elected Democrats won't don't really want to talk about him. I think, what you're seeing is there's kind of two New Yorks in politics. One is the real New York City where people live and vote, and the other is New York City as a character that exists, within kind of the Fox News imagination, or as just this kind of symbol of what Democrats are, or what cities are, things like that. And so Mamdani does serve a very useful function, for conservatives, for Republicans, for their kind of media allies. He's a Muslim socialist. He's from Africa. Like, this is what people said Barack Obama was, but for real. And so they're going to make a lot of hay of that. And it is interesting to see how this plays out now in this long running, since November debate within the Democratic Party about what they want to be, because I think a lot of Democrats who don't align with him ideologically at all are still looking at what he's done with a kind of a little bit of awe. Like, they've been talking about, we need to spend $30 million to reach young people with podcasts or something like that. Well, this guy basically took over everybody in New York City's, TikTok feed and Instagram Explorer page with these like really, really catchy, really simple to understand, videos on really simple to understand policies. This guy just kind of went out and did it. So it's really injected kind of a new energy into this intra-party fighting. And I think kind of the consternation of a lot of the moderates who have been pitching their ideas of what to do. This came from, the left wing of the party.
Do you think a lot of that has to do with his age? I mean, Cuomo's late 60s, and Mamdani's literally less than half of his age, right?
Yeah. Mamdani is still only 33, and he is, it's sort of been said in the aftermath of the election, but he is really like one of the most, the first truly like online digital native politicians, who have come out. I mean, he's just completely fluent in this. This is how he communicates. Of course, he's going to whip out his phone and film this video. Like, he has a sense of what works in 15, 30-second intervals, 1 minute. He's, of course, the son of a filmmaker and has like a kind of a natural gift for how to do things. And it's just a kind of a generational talent level of communicator. Whether he's a generational talent level of getting things done in City Hall in Albany very much remains to be seen. But you've seen since the election, because Andrew Cuomo is not going away, he's going to run as an independent. He's tried to make these videos on his own. He's kind of adopted Mamdani's like soft filter. He's adopted the kind of walking toward the camera like video trope. He's on the streets, shaking hands, doing things. Like, he's kind of trying to make the videos, but it just doesn't work when you're the 67-year-old kind of wooden former governor.
Well, when you were saying that, I was just feeling like very cringe about the whole thing, I got to say.
Yeah.
So I think it's a safe assumption that Mamdani's going to win. And so I'm wondering, you talk about getting things done, how will we be able to tell, what will you be looking for to determine whether or not he's being a successful mayor or not? I mean, are there any kind of like specific metrics you think are useful to look at would be? And also, how much time do we need for him to get settled in before we start looking at that and actually evaluating that sort of thing? And I ask this because it seems to me there's an awful lot of pressure on him, because if he's successful as a mayor, I think that sends a really strong message to democratic socialists around the country, and people are maybe interested in democratic socialism. But if he fails, then that could potentially set that back quite a bit. So what do you think? What are you going to be looking for?
Yeah, and I would just say he's the clear favorite heading into November, but Cuomo is still in the race. I don't think Eric Adams really has a lot going for him at this point. Cuomo's still in the race, and it's still a race. There's still a lot of money waiting to be spent, potentially, attacking Mamdani from Cuomo or Adams aligned super PACs. Mamdani is likely to win. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion at this point. But to your overall question, I mean, I think, there is this, it sort of depends on how people actually do evaluate his performance, how the people who voted for him, feel about what they get. Because, if they're not going to get everything, if they're not going to get free buses, but like they get a few free bus lines, and bus lines are faster because the Department of Transportation is no longer just like kind of beholden to people parking their cars in the middle of the street. Like, will people just kind of feel better about it? Like, maybe, if he's able to freeze the rent, like, I think people would probably consider that, even just for a year, people would probably consider that like a reprieve, that they'd appreciate. Whether he's able to deliver anything on childcare, or even whether he's just able to preserve pre-K as it exists, in the face of like enormous budget constraints that seem to be coming, in part because of this new bill from Washington. That will kind of determine how he's received. So, there's this kind of irony where he's run on this platform of things, but the challenges that he's going to face as a mayor in a kind of a Donald Trump environment, are probably a lot different, and in some cases a far greater set of challenges than simply negotiating with Kathy Hochul. So I think how he's able to manage, those budget, the kind of impending budget crisis that he's being handed, and how, whether he's able to kind of spin off getting 50% of what he wants as a victory, will kind of go a long way to determining how these things go. I will say, like, he's had not too much experience in Albany, and the experiences that have come out of Albany have been kind of a mixed bag as an assemblyman. Like, he helped get this pilot for free buses, for instance. He helped win, a settlement to get a lot more money to taxi drivers who were, deeply in debt for taxi medallions. But he wasn't like a Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson either. So he's a very much kind of unproven, certainly as an executive, but even kind of unproven as somebody in the halls of power. And he's bringing a great deal of energy, and a great deal of kind of public backing to the job if he wins. But the actual kind of capacity to get down and do the work is very much unknown.
And I guess I want to close on talking about some of those unknowns, maybe, or speculating, because, I mean, mayor of New York, that's a big job for anyone. That's a tough job, even if you've had 30 years in politics and have the support of the business community and all that. It seems to me that Mamdani's coming in with a lot of energy, right? A lot of big ideas, but not a lot of experience and not a lot of powerful people behind him. In fact, I think you make the case that a lot of powerful people would believe that it's in their best interest to be able to point to his administration, to make his administration a failure. And so I guess I'm wondering, when you look at this whole situation, because you spent a lot of time thinking and writing about Mamdani, do you think, what makes you feel optimistic about his potential mayorship of New York City?
Yeah, I mean, I think he unlocked something that candidates have wanted to do and have failed at in the past in the city, and built a kind of a new coalition, incredibly energized coalition, and a far younger coalition than we've seen. If you look at who was voting for Eric Adams, the biggest turnout was among people aged like 60 to 65. For Mamdani's election, the biggest turnout was people 30 to 35. He managed to create basically an entirely new power base within the city, this incredible kind of cross-cultural collection of, North Brooklyn yuppies and Yemeni shop owners, and even kind of a decent showing in like the northern parts of Manhattan. And so there is like the Mamdani coalition is real. And that's something that's, different from what we've had in New York City politics. And it represented a reckoning with how things had been conducted and who had been conducting them in New York State more broadly, but New York City in particular. And so you had this kind of clap back at a former 3-term governor, at the members of Congress, and other elected officials who were kind of lining up, to support him, and at kind of the big money, and even some of the unions that were in his corner. So I think he's got his work cut out for him, absolutely, but he's already demonstrated kind of a popular will in his corner and a capacity to go well beyond what democratic socialists might maybe be confined by in other realms, and kind of to demonstrate a kind of a team building pragmatic streak in order to actually get across the finish line. So I think there's certainly the seeds of something there if he's able to continue cultivating it, but it's of course very easy to see how things can go wrong.
Well, on that note, we will close. And I should point out to folks that I would highly recommend checking out Tim's work. It's not just about New York City politics. He writes about a ton of stuff. The article or the thing you did with David Corn on the Declaration of Independence, the King George, and how that applies to Trump. There's all kinds of cool stuff, though, I would say. Definitely check him out. Check out Mother Jones. It was a lot of fun reading the articles and preparing for this. And Tim, it's been great talking with you today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,